So we are ready to start our afternoon session, and I'm very happy to present you the next speaker. It's Mónica Amor from the Maryland Institute College of Art. Mónica Amor holds a PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has written art criticism and essays for Art Margins, Art Forum, Art Journal, Art Nexus, Grey Room, October, Polyester, Third Text, and Trans. So all the very, very important art journals. She has curated several exhibitions, including Gego, Defying Structures, for the Serralves Foundation in Porto in 2006. Mónica Amor is professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Her book, Theories of the Non-Object, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, 1944 to 1968, was published in 2016 by the University of California Press. And her current book, which we are very much looking forward to, is titled Gego, Weaving the Space in Between, and it will come out with Yale University Press in 2023. So Mónica will give a talk on public intervals, and we are very much looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the lovely introduction, to Stephanie Reisinger for the invitation, and everyone here in Stuttgart, Tobias, and for welcoming us. And I want to thank, because this comes out of my book, I want to thank Claudia Garcés at the Gego Foundation and Rigel Garcia, and specifically for this section of the research, my colleague Jesus Fuemayor, who shared some material with me. Cuerdas, one of a number of public art pieces that Gego produced between 1968 and 1989 under the auspicious support of private enterprises and local agencies, was a demarcating structure made of segments of parallel ropes of nylon, signaling the space between building and architectural frame. It was located just outside of a gallery of art, to later become a museum, built in 1972 as part of a large residential, commercial development called Parque Central. The massive complex occupies 17 hectares of land east of the downtown area of the city. One of its most salient features is the multi-level area, which takes up almost the entire site and was conceived to allow multi-use and rationalized patterns of movement for consumers and residents alike. 8 massive towers of apartments and 2 of offices were constructed on the grounds of the 3rd level, where one also encounters communal services and green areas designed by the Brazilian landscapist designer Roberto Burle Marx. Modern living for the ordinary citizen was enhanced. Promotional articles written at the time claim by the planned circulation for cars and pedestrians, designed to offer all the advantages of city living inside and outside Parque Central. On April of 1972, Gego was approached by Delpre, the grantee company in charge of the complex, to make a public work of art in the first area under construction. Shortly thereafter, she submitted a proposal and a series of sketches that detailed the production of the piece under the supervision of the architecture firm Ciso, Shaw & Associates, which designed the buildings and public areas of the compound. She had only 4 months to plan, produce, and install the work. The resulting project was made up of 4 groups, or systems, as Gego called them in her notes and sketches, of 28 thick nylon ropes each that spanned the space between the building of the museum and the lower levels of the south area of the complex. All the groups of nylon ropes depart from large bars of metal attached to the concrete frame of the south side of the museum building and are interrupted by similar beams of aluminum featuring rings traversed by ropes to facilitate the modulation and twist of the linear planes. Each bar was given a letter and a number in the orientation sketch done by Gego and served as anchorage device that determined the variable distance between the ropes. There is no doubt that though ethereal and anti-monumental, as I will argue throughout, cuerdas, which eludes immediate conceptual grasp and visual comprehension, only a bird's eye view could remedy this utter disregard for totality, attest to Gego's engineering training. To secure the scaffolding of the structure, each group of ropes is framed by wires of steel that connect to the solid beams around which pivot the fiber cords. The first system, the shorter and lower group of ropes, introduces the basic generative structure pursued in the other levels. It departs from the elevated ground floor of the museum to attach itself to a beam of aluminum suspended 5 meters away from the ground floor of level 3 of the complex. The group, which traverses a distance of approximately 10 meters, then continues slightly downward towards another metal bar, this one sitting on the floor of the level 3. The second, third, and fourth systems deploy similar but more complicated behaviors. The twisting of the linear fields is more abrupt, the area covered is much larger, the rotations are more consistent. The third system features a fully vertical pole of 6.10 meters with wires that intersect and swivel in 4 different directions. NG5 and G9 flushed a curtain of water that literalized the zigzagging flow deployed by the cascading ropes of nylon. In these, the cuerdas ricochet the formal and thematic explorations of the chorros, a series of works developed 2 years before. A letter dated June 10, 1972, written by Gego, explains the different factors she had taken into consideration to project the work and expresses her dissatisfaction with the little time she had been given for its construction. The piece, she wrote, accentuated the importance of recreational space that marginally opened up in between and around the imposing physique of the buildings. The point of departure for the work was an old idea of hers of hanging reticularias between skyscrapers and above the streets of the urban center. Indeed, a small sketch probably done around '69 while Gego was installing her reticularia in New York City shows a street framed by buildings connected by a large triangulated net that weaves the space in between them and looms over passersby. Space frames and mobile architectures, widely publicized in architectural magazines during the 1950s and 1960s, were important references to Gego. And the Reticularia of 1969, as well as this whimsical sketch with no pretension to model a possible realization, can be thought of as imaginative and fragile responses that counter the techno-optimism of this brand of architecture, including the visionary and mega-structure typologies which Parque Central nodded towards. The latter's promise of efficiency, liberation from the constraints of tradition, and a smooth rapport between buildings and city offered Gego the opportunity to engage with an architectural imaginary that was both seductive and flawed. If Parque Central recalled the futuristic urban fictions of spatial urbanism in France, Kenzo Tange and the Metabolist in Japan, Archigram and Cedric Price in Britain, Cuerdas could be seen as a repost to the fragile utopian translation that the monumental urban complex represented. That Gego saw in Cuerdas, in its scale and placement, responding Hechizo Cuerdas, responding to that architectural imaginary, is suggested by the inclusion of the cover of the book, The Architecture of Fantasy, Utopian Building and Planning in Modern Times, in one of her folders for the Parque Central project. The examples included in the book were less programmatic than the more organized responses to a critique of the modern city, to which, the mega structure, alluded. Mega structures, we could see them as a kind of a more, again, organized and programmatic response than these more, again, fantastic and unrealized projects from this book. However, as the majestic inverted pyramid that the Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer had designed for a museum in Caracas in 1955, featured in the book, Parque Central too was once an implausible undertaking. But political ambition meant to trigger civic pride and satisfy the aspirational restlessness of the oil-funded state can't be underestimated. This persistent investment in construction and monumentality as the best expression of the modern nation was accompanied and preceded by numerous debates regarding the site. I mean the site where Parque Central is situated. These debates were the product of a characteristically modern concern with the revitalization of the city center, which by the early 60s could not properly serve a metropolitan area that had grown exponentially. Deliberations targeted the neighborhood of El Conde, which is where Parque Central is located, which was founded, it's a neighborhood that was founded in 1926, and was adjacent, or is adjacent, to the central axis of the Avenida Bolívar, which throughout the decade had been the locus of urban implosion, arbitrary planning at best, improvisation at worst. The result of tentative studies commissioned by the Centro Simón Bolívar, hereafter CSB, in charge of urban development of the city of Caracas, Parque Central materialized there after a decade of hesitations concerning the allocation of urban resources for an area that had been in the hands of the state since the mid-50s. The Avenida Bolívar was the pivotal element of an urban proposal that posited an expansion towards the east of the city, where a number of peripheral residential areas were developing. Said proposal, formulated in 1939 by a French commission of urbanists, bet on the primacy of vehicular circulation and replaced the order of the colonial matrix developed during 400 years by a linear axis running from west to east. Looming over this foundational avenue of modernity was the Centro Simón Bolívar, the building itself, designed by Cipriano Dominguez and built between 1949 and 1954. The CSB, as well as numerous skyscrapers featuring ground floors with public access and amenities serving commercial and administrative functions, proliferated in Caracas during the 50s. Parque Central, however, as I have already mentioned, owes its futuristic ambitions, scale, and habitational density to the architectural megastructures that dominated the imagination of European and Asian urbanists in the 60s. Its immediate local antecedent, though, is an unrealized project conceived around 1965. In a descriptive memory of the ensemble, published in Punto Magazine in 1966, the ambitious proposal put the emphasis on systems, on flexibility, on integrated solutions that would create meaningful environments, and on the nature of collective form. These concerns, the team of architects in charge of the design stated, echoing architectural avant-garde parlance, would resolve in a generative model based on repetition and the interchangeability of parts and elements, a complex that would resonate in turn with the surrounding urban matrix of downtown Caracas and materialize in an auto-controlled organization. The country's booming petroeconomy facilitated the multiple studies and surveys that founded the elaborate proposal. However, the latter was preceded by opaque, discontinuous, and fractured institutional discussions heavily shaped by electoral priorities. That same year, upon news that the government had decided to cancel the project to develop a park, journalist Aquiles Nasoa, humoristically writing under the nom de plume Matias Carrasco, lingered on the capricious nature of the decision. Nasoa had started his short article precisely with that pervasive image of implosion that characterized the urban landscape of Caracas in the 60s and beyond. Quote, after fabricating in the heart of Caracas a landscape belonging to the bombarded Europe of the 40s, those responsible, question mark, for the demolition declare, as if nothing, that the lots of the old urbanization will not be destined to the construction of housing and will instead become a green area, end quote. Putting a question mark after the word responsible gestured to a culture of managerial unaccountability of which many complained. No doubt a park was a great idea, Nasoa wrote, but he lamented the lack of consistency and waste of resources. The crude rationality of the 1950s dictatorship had not given place to sensible planning and the prioritizing of an accord between the city and its inhabitants. Instead, confronted interests, inconsistent policies, faulty studies, and the politicization of a process shaped by a fractured state, where actions shift according to the party in government, made El Conde a testing ground for the whims of a fragile democracy. If the 1966 project articulated a longing, as architect Jacobo Koifman observed in the Punto dossier, one that aspired to embody the paradigms of mobility, flexibility, adaptability, and density dear to the international avant-garde, it also introduced the possibility of a new scale, monumental, ultra-functional, innovative, magnified, and materialized by Parque Central only 3 years later. It would be another political crux, one that involved a new party in power and a new friendly appointment to the presidency of the CSB, which would allow the realization of the Venezuelan megastructure. Assigned now with servicing the middle classes that had brought Rafael Caldera to power, Gustavo Rodriguez Amengual, a friend of the president and now CSB's new leader, pursued a multi-use residential project fully financed by foreign capital. This fiscal configuration responded to the government's demand that the project be profitable, realized before the elections of 1973, and that financial backing be separate from the regular budget of the CSB so as to avoid approval from the opposition-controlled Congress. The complex was to house 6,812 middle-class apartments of different sizes and configurations in 8 residential towers of 44 floors, capped by penthouse facilities with recreational spaces and schools. 2 gigantic office towers of 59 floors became, later in the decade, the highest skyscrapers in Latin America. Parque Central incorporated work, commerce, residential, and leisure activities in an articulation of modernity that bet on a new monumentality of prestige and radical innovation. One of the most distinctive aspects of Parque Central is the multi-level foundation of the site, which encompasses a vast network of open and closed spaces that sustained its public life. I use the past tense, constituted by parking space, restaurants and stores, services such as banks and post office, green areas and patios. This vast field of human activity distributed along a vertical structure porous to its surroundings encompass a city within a city. And I think Hania used that same phrasing. This is a different kind of city, though. But this structure on a beam, rather than a tautology, was to model the ideal modern city that Caracas remained to be. As one of the brochures boasted, quote, "In Parque Central, everything is right outside your home's door. The fascinating world that a splendorous modern city offers extends at your feet like a carpet. Everything that you long for, your material well-being and leisure, is within reach by foot. In Parque Central, the people can recover their pedestrian hierarchy and become owners and masters of their spaces," end quote. In other words, Parque Central aimed to restore civic agency through pedestrian leisure and consumption, increasingly taxing to inhabitants in the vehicle-driven city. It embodied an epochal fascination with mobility. In it, peoples, goods, and services circulated freely. An image of Gego's cuerdas reproduced in a brochure titled, quote, "The Commercial Heart of Downtown Caracas," was juxtaposed to a full page of text that opened with the word connections. The connections celebrated in this opening paragraph concerned pedestrian traffic and the easy access offered to those walking to the cultural core of the city, where there were music venues and other museums, a park. It is in this east side area of the complex, with direct access to and from the Avenida Bolívar, that the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo was built and inaugurated on February 20, 1974. Initially, a glass box with inclined roof covered with greenery was designed by architect Tomás Lugo as an art gallery. It was this space that served as the core of the museum, later reformulated by Nicolas Sidorkov, and which Gego used to anchor her ropes to weave them across the space toward the parking, ground floor, and mezzanine sectors of the site. The architects came with a tiny model, and those are her words, of the space. She told José Antonio Pantin in 1982 in an interview. A fact that accords with the tiny space cuerdas would come to occupy and ask her if she could do something with this space. One of them, she told Pantin, knew of her dreams about reticularias between skyscrapers, and those are her words again, which the charming drawing mentioned above confirms. Thoughts of triangular nets, though, were put aside by a punitive 4-month deadline, and so the idea of using ropes came to be. Ropes, Gego said to Pantin in reply to his suggestion that she was working with a material out of necessity, were also, quote, fascinating. And she made allusions to sailing and threads and weaving, all of which to her has a certain relation, her words. She had used the thick industrial ropes of nylon in 1967 for the Torrecedilla's work that we already saw once, which was in collaboration with her partner Gerd Leufer, as in other works, public works. Now, the now dismembered work made up of a system of 52 nylon cords attached to a ring base of metal and twisted once in a conical helix, owed much in its soaring verticality to the Torre del Reloj, 1954, which looms over the rectory plaza of Carlos Raúl Villanueva's Universidad Central, about which Hania spoke at length. Only 50 centimeters lower than the clock tower, which stands 20 5 meters high, Gego and Leufert's own is in several ways its opposite. Made with pliant materials instead of resistant concrete, signaling a shopping mall and to be seen from a car, instead of guiding the pace of walking students at the university, purely symbolic instead of also functional. In its use of 12 bulbs of neon all along its core and theatrical light reflectors at the base, which lead the structure at night, the torre may be said to anticipate a fascination with new materials and luminous effects not to be found again in Gego's public works. Indeed, a hybrid paradigm reliant on natural elements such as water and wind, mechanical movement, a spectacular scale and light burst into the Caracas scene soon after with the sculptures designed by Alejandro Otero, Mercedes Pardo, and Ligia Olivieri. The occasion for this grand intervention, produced under the aegis of an homage to Caracas, was to be the quadricentennial celebration of the city. The grounds for the central attractions? El Conde, which was at the time a vast wasteland, which lay in ruins, awaiting a permanent resolution of political satisfaction. And so I show you the Centro Simón Bolívar up there, and I'll come back to this white shed, which is part of our story here of celebration of the 400th anniversary of the city. It is worth parsing the main aspects of this event of monumental scale and contradiction, which frames the unframing lucidity of Cuerdas. Pivoting around a multimedia spectacle of colossal ambitions and budget, later titled Imagen de Caracas, the central narrative, made up of films and slide projections, aimed to retell the story of Caracas from its foundation to the present. The result was a fragmented cinematic presentation supported by a technological landscape of new audiovisual media aimed to recreate urban modes of perception. The event was housed in a supersized industrial shed made of steel and aluminum designed by architect Juan Pedro Posani that occupied a whole hectare of the terrain 27 meters above ground. Inside the device city, as the construction was called, a network of tubular structures and towers, some connected by aerial bridges, sustained the gigantic screens that would serve as support for the projections. Meanwhile, viewers would traverse the kinetic environment of continuous sound and visual stimulation through ramps, thus becoming part of and engulfed by the spectacle. The latter was meant to be a critical reassessment of the history of the city, and it was to be for the masses, which the adjacent fairgrounds would welcome with kinetic mega sculptures, kiosks, café, concerts, and exhibitions of books and paintings. Geared towards the people, El Conde would thus be refashioned as an agora, a public space and sphere suitable to the post-dictatorial petrostate of futurity. If Imagen de Caracas posed the past as matter ripe for public debate and reflection, the ferial grounds, as we will see, aim to stage a future of immaterial energy and optimism. Indeed, this complementary component of the magnanimous commemoration originally included 26 spatial structures to be located nearby the white shed, and described by artist Alejandro Otero to the press as a visual fist that signaled the city's vocation of futurity. In fact, a short article reporting on the preparatory work done on the terrain posited the multimedia event as an image of the Caracas of the past versus the fairgrounds image of the future. El Conde described in one of the most comprehensive press articles on the proposal as an elephant of steel soccer rods was to be reconstituted in an outdoors piñata at the scale of the city. These words come from the article. This vast hallucinatory landscape of, and now I'm using Otero's words, spatial structures produced thanks to hundreds of pages filled with, quote, structural calculations realized by electronic machines, end quote, involved the use of local products. Our aluminum, said Otero, our steel. The artistic intervention was thus to realize the prodigy of the nation through its natural resources, but also the know-how of its professional, architects, engineers, and artists. According to Pedro Sosa, architect in charge, the team effort aimed to hold, quote, theories of underdevelopment, end quote, concerning culture, and reflect the dynamism of the city. To channel this techno-national enterprise of post-colonial ambitions, nothing imported, Otero insisted, quote, we use fundamentally cellular construction by modules based on fine metallic profiles, colored, plain, or three-dimensional, but excluding all decorative effect, end quote. The technological mirage that the internal and the external spectacles represented never manifested in all its glory, though. Only after the abrupt closing of Imagen de Caracas, 2 months after its opening, 8 works were installed in El Conde. Despite their asynchronous installation with the main event, their reduced number, and their undefined urban context, they were hailed in the press as feasts of the imagination powered by light, water, wind, and the technical skill of the professional architects, engineers, and artisans involved. To critic Roberto Guevara, the installed structures were colossal watchtowers from where to oversee the advance towards the future, and their permanent installation, under consideration at the time, would offer Caracas the opportunity to showcase and pioneer a grandiose contemporary realization. Inocente Palacios, writing in the press a month after their installation, spoke about a technical desideratum that Otero's works accomplished, referring to the group of works which was originally designed to occupy what should have been the fairgrounds of Imagen de Caracas. He managed to articulate, though not name, what would later be known as a new scale in the arts. Quote, sculptural works of large proportions that overflow the problems of a sculptor proper to address those of a structural architecture and urbanism, end quote. Only a year later, several of the 8 works, which in 1968 had been described as portable, made of permanent materials that never oxidate nor stain, all made in the country, in the best Venezuelan workshops, laid in lamentable conditions, as if consumed by the entropic inevitability of the site. The splendorous artifacts that Palacio and other writers had described with qualifiers such as purity, impeccability, beauty, quality, truth, and clarity, just a few months before, were on the brink of becoming ruinous machines. One of several photographs documenting the works installed in El Conde features La Noria, and you're seeing it here on the screen, fully operating, while its metal sails swivel, dematerializing in pure luminosity. The work was a clear instantiation of what Otero had described as a transmutation, quote, of matter and space into pure energy, while the photograph, which also included vertical vibrante oro y plata, evoked a lunar landscape of cosmic machines. What then is the place of cuerdas in all of these? I want to propose that cuerdas has no place, that although architecturally cited, the work plotted with lines the interval in its refusal to monumentalize and advance the cost of a nueva escala, which will come to define the public sculpture that populated Caracas, the Caracas of the 70s, rather than affirming and representing Cuerdas refuted the public sculptor/monument nexus, which the reticularia, with its dismissal of mass, hierarchies, and containment, had already addressed. This anti-object public sculpture put the emphasis on a number of operations that counter the imperative to represent and the identification between work and site that is essential to the genre. Gego turned instead towards inflection to probe possible relations among architecture, urban space, the city, and the bodies within it. I repurposed the term from Bernard Koch's Architectural Anti-Manifesto, Earth Moves, The Furnishing of Territories, 1983, which, as its title suggests, dwells on the instability and relational quality of our milieus. This is a space that evades settling and is described by surfaces of variable curvature, perpetually out of phase. Those are Koch's words. In fact, he sees territories as an intersection of concrete and abstract vectors that, against, quote, simple historical succession, produce multifactorial entities in constant change, end quote. So that rather than speaking of the identity of a place, he argues for forms of transience that can connect the space in between these localized vectors. Indeed, he warns of an architectural tendency to equate all too easy, quote, the notion of a specificity with that of identity, end quote. And it states that, quote, if the expression genius loci has any meaning, it lies in the capacity of this genius to be smart enough to allow for the transformation or transit from one identity to the other, end quote. So that against the arresting verticality of Parque Central, which had not fully materialized in 1972 when Cuerdas was inaugurated, the work put the accent not on monumentality and the sculptural neo-scale that had been inaugurated on that same site in 1968, not on identity, not on representation, nor site specificity, but on modulation. It is no coincidence that in a short entry text accompanying photos of Cuerdas in the 1977 book of Gego's work, poet Hani Osot referred to the work as, quote, modulating textiles, end quote. The undulating movement of the ropes, she explained, referencing hammocks and other textile objects, sewing the open space between the concrete framework of the architecture. This interval space of possibilities materialized through airy surfaces made of lines that enclosed no space, but that, owing to the rotations of the four systems of planes that constituted the work, embodied multidirectionality. Osot's reference to a fabric-like pliancy to describe the warping of the grid that Cuerdas performs is key. Like a cloth, Cuerdas is yielding and offers the possibility of further expansion. I'm going to skip a little. Indeed, there is no holistic apprehension of Cuerdas. The entrapped openness of the work eludes any full view. To explore it, one has to climb the surrounding architectural frame or look from the ground below the crisscrossing rows of ropes traversing the space. Regardless of the viewer's position, the work only delivers partial views, a permanent incompleteness. There is no programmatic stance in Cuerdas, which Gego boasted she could simply sketch to her welder with minimal calculations. Quote, because if I had done technical drawings like an engineer, the welder would not have understood, end quote. Indeed, unlike Otero's problem/solution computational paradigm, Gego's intercalary fields of lines are a topological proposition anterior to representation. No proper top or bottom, right or left, no inside or outside, no figure against a ground, no techno-prodigy. Cuerdas, in other words, is as tentative as Otero's sculptures are assertive. A heliographic copy of a rather abstract rendition of Cuerdas, in sepia rather than in the traditional blue of technical drawings, shows an impossible, unobstructed bird's eye view of the flowing planes of lines. The architectural frames that hold the twisting linear fields are barely insinuated, with faint angular traces, and this accentuates the abstract nature of the drawing, but also its anti-sculptural, anti-gravitational, and anti-narrative bearing. Looking at this impossible image from an impossible point of view, the drawing echoes a gigantic loom framed by the architecture's own frames, a field of inflected warps threads anterior to the impotentia interweaving of weft threads. In this figural evocation of the weaving apparatus, a situated spectator could not apprehend this image in its totality. I want to remind you of these. I'm arguing that cuerdas enunciated relational possibilities and signal contingent ways of weaving the urban fabric of the city. In its plotting of the interval, cuerdas intimated pliant negotiations between different urban configurations with a special consideration to the hybrid sites that architecture might come to occupy. As is evident from the urban histories of El Conde, quote, the surface of the territory is mobile and fluid as it is given to the continual distortions of memory and of matter, we may add. Accordingly, cuerdas ended up memorializing an absence, the margins assigned to public space within a market-driven economy that had little regard for planning and continuity. This absence gestured as well towards the impossibility of collective memory in a city where history was leaking through the ubiquitous cracks the project of modern renovation had imposed on it, as demonstrated by the ups and downs of the neighborhood. I'm going to leave it here. There's a few other things, but one last reference I wanted to bring before closing, a couple of articles by architect Alberto Sato and Posani criticizing the two architectural typologies that Parque Central embodied, the shopping mall and the skyscraper. And it was Posani who very curiously ended his book on architecture in the city by, instead of calling attention, instead of thinking of the interval, the kind of patchwork architecture that this lack of planning was generating in the city during the 60s, and he was particularly critical of this economic dynamics that had produced these patchwork dynamics. So he wrote, from the air, differences of income or class or functional specializations are attenuated. Everything assumes the common traits of useless failure, unjustified in the face of the immense possibilities offered by the valley. One discovers then the power of those forces invisible from above, the forces of the economic network established and organized, which fixes like an immaterial but solid tissue the heap of contradictions the absurd made city, end quote. All right, I'll leave it here. Thank you.